All right, good evening. Give me one second, just verifying. All right, good evening, everybody. On behalf of the May 1st Coordinating Committee here in San Diego, this is the seventh in the 7-part series. So the final section and series of a series of panel of workshops leading up to International Workers' Day, May 1st, an internationally recognized day of struggle, of class struggle, uh, to challenge the dictatorship of capital and capitalism and their ability to continue to oppress and exploit humanity as a whole. We have a list of panelists from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the Palestinian Youth Movement, Unión del Barrio, Anak Bayan, United Auto Workers, and our comrades and fraternal organization, the African People's Socialist Party. I want to recognize every panelist who made the time to join us this evening to discuss the question of wars, sanctions, and economic blockades. Clearly, our May 1st coalition has taken a position to oppose these criminal sanctions, these criminal economic, financial, and commercial blockades, as well as this ongoing war that has been waged against humanity as a whole ever since the creation of this country, of this nation, of this white settler nation known as the United States. So on behalf of Unión del Barrio and the May 1st Coalition, I'd like to welcome our panelists this evening. For those that are joining in as attendees, as we go through this presentation, as we go through after the introduction of the speakers and the panel presentations, you'll have the opportunity to raise your hand and we can recognize you and you can ask questions. Or if you'd like to send questions through the chat, you can go ahead and do so that we have a little bit of time to discuss any questions that people may have from any of the panelists. So with that, I'd like to open it up to our panelists. If they can present themselves, you can say your name and a little bit of the organization that you represent. We'll have about 2 minutes per person during this time. So I'll go ahead and why don't we go ahead and start based on the people that, on the order in which people logged in. So I'll go ahead and recognize the African People's Socialist Party first. If you can go ahead and start, Comrade Bakri.
Thank you, Ben Amin. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this event and extending their invitation for the African People's Socialist Party to be on this panel. My name is Bakri Olatunji. I am the Western Regional Representative of the African People's Socialist Party. It is an organization that was founded in 1972 by Omala Yeshitela, who is the world leader of the African Liberation Movement. We have been 50 years on the ground struggling for a self-determined African nation to rise. We have built organizations throughout Africa and throughout Europe, throughout the US, the Bahamas. We have built an international organizations of African revolutionaries, and we are building on the ground every single day to overturn this foul, vicious, capitalist, colonialist system that exploits the labor of people all around the world for the benefit of primarily a white nation. So we are happy to be here, to be on this panel. And I just wanted to say that. And just to say one last note before I move on is that the African People's Socialist Party represents the African working class. And we have to say that. Anyway, I just wanted to just make a quick introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bakri. If Brother Eric, you can go ahead and present yourself.
Hi, yes, my name is Eric. I am an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in the San Diego branch. The PSL was founded in 2004, and we are a revolutionary socialist party who believes that as workers, we create all of the wealth in our society, and we should be the ones who run it, rather than what we have now under capitalism, which is a parasitic class of bosses and CEOs who do none of the work, reap all of the profits, and they are destroying our planet and keeping most workers in or near poverty. So we seek to replace that with a system of socialism where the working class is put in charge and the economy is planned so that essentially we don't have crises like the one we find ourselves in right now. PSL is also one of the leading members, and I'm proud to be an organizer with the Answer Coalition, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, which was founded just 3 days after the September 11th attacks, in response to what even within those 3 days proved to be a very disturbing calls for war and racist attacks, both on the interpersonal level and in the form of government policies. So we've been fighting against war and racism and police brutality ever since. And thank you for having us on this panel today.
Thank you very much. And if we can, I'd like to ask Yazan to please introduce yourself in the Palestinian Youth Movement.
Hi folks, my name is Yazan and I'm with the Palestinian Youth Movement in San Diego. Historically, the Palestinian Youth Movement in different formations is going on about 10 years now and started as a transnational effort actually. So Palestinian organizers from all over the world coming together to reassess the political condition of Palestinians given the several decades that had passed since the original Nakba in 1948, and looking at different ways to recreate Palestinian resistance against settler colonial Zionism and imperial capitalism from the United States. San Diego's work specifically lately has been looking at surveillance programs in San Diego and how they connect to US militarism, US profits from militarism, and also looking at the ways in which really critical joint struggle partnerships are important in understanding how material violences that sometimes look different are playing out in really, really similar tactics from nations like the United States or the Zionist entity. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Yazan. And United Auto Workers Local 2350, Karen Plasencia.
Buenas tardes. Good evening, everybody. My name is Karen Plasencia, and I am a rep with United Auto Workers Local 2350. Our union represents union employees, so workers within union reps, within CSUs, state agencies, and other public sector agencies in the state of California. And as union representatives, you know, not everybody within labor is conscious and has, unfortunately, working people as their priority. But a lot of us do understand that if as unions, what we really want to see is workers empowered, that we need to look for alternatives. In the system that we have now, workers are relegated to the worst conditions as we see now during this pandemic. So we are very excited to join you all today and have this conversation.
Great, thank you. And we do have a panelist that is trying to get on. So as soon as she jumps on, we'll go ahead and introduce her. She's from Malacbayan, San Diego. In the meantime, though, I did want to go ahead and read the point of unity, which brought the San Diego May 1st Coalition together to address the ongoing imperialist genocide that the United States has promoted throughout the world. And it reads, the United States is weaponizing COVID-19 pandemic by tightening unilaterally imposed economic, financial, and commercial blockades on nations that disagree with the United States. These imperialist blockades are meant to cause profound suffering to the peoples of these nations as a means for so-called regime change. These commercial, economic, and financial blockades constitute a policy of genocide against the people and nations. We uphold the right to self-determination of the peoples of the world and demand an end to the US blockade of Cuba, Venezuela, Palestine, Yemen, and Iran. And I know that there's others, not to make it an extensive list, but it is important to highlight also North Korea. We further stand in solidarity with the Cuban International Medical Brigades, currently serving in more than 22 countries to help confront the COVID-19 pandemic. And we say no to war against Venezuela or Iran. and any other nation that this imperialist country wants to promote. So this is the general, the principle of unity that is bringing people together right now in this historic moment of the COVID-19 pandemic, recognizing International Workers' Day as an important day of international solidarity. And with that, I do want to open up the panel discussion. But before I do that, let me recognize comrade sister Victoria from Anakbayan, San Diego. If you'd like to present yourself, your organization, and then maybe we can just start off by, if you can go ahead and start the presentation, the panel piece of it, if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
Victoria?
absolutely. Sorry about hopping on late. Thank you. It's good to see you all, meet you all for the first time too, virtually. I'm looking forward to us meeting in person once this is all over. My name is Victoria. I am the Secretary General for Anakbayan San Diego. So Anakbayan San Diego is a mass youth organization, a Filipino youth organization. We work with Filipino youth and students throughout the country, working on local campaigns to address the needs of the Filipino communities here in the United States, but also to fight for national democracy and genuine liberation in the Philippines. You know, some of the campaigns that we're working on right now primarily is the Oust Duterte campaign. He is the current president. He's one of the most fascist presidents that we've had. But I think that, you know, part of this being like one of our main campaigns is to recognize that we're continuing this revolutionary history of ousting presidents, but we're here today to finish the job by ousting US imperialism completely. Because we recognize that he is a puppet president, but there is a root problem here that's affecting not only the Philippines, but the entire world. Yeah, so that's like pretty much the introduction for Anakbayan. And I'm sorry, I was kind of cluing in a little bit, but do you mind if we start with a different panelist
no problem,
first?
no problem.
Then,
That's
okay.
no problem. Thank you very much. I didn't want to put you on the spot. I just thought about that.
No, thank you.
And said, I didn't want to do that. So why don't we go ahead and start with Comrade Bakri from the African People's Socialist Party, so this way we can get this really rolling.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it again, and I want to welcome all of the other panelists. I think some I may have seen before if they were ever up in San Jose, but I don't think people are that familiar to me. But I just wanted to say that, you know, the African People's Socialist Party, particularly during this so-called pandemic, this coronavirus that we in the African People's Socialist Party call the colonial virus. We understand that right now we sum up that colonialism is the virus, and that the cure for that virus, from our perspective, is Black power, is for the African working class to seize power, to have the power to determine, our own ability to feed, house, and clothe ourselves. I got to turn my phone down. And, you know, I just think when we talk about the state of things right now with this pandemic, we have to look at the fact that African people were colonized before COVID-19 and were colonized now during COVID-19. And we see the struggle for African people is to rid ourselves of a foul, vicious, parasitic social system that has been sucking the blood of African people since it first came to Africa centuries ago and forced their will, the European nation, the white nation that was born off of this relationship. They have been on the welfare of African people for 600 years. It is the free labor of African people working in the interest of building a white nation, building a European nation that again has been around for 600 years. And you see everywhere where African people have been taken since we've been taken away from Africa, scattered all over the planet, you see there is not a place on the planet Earth where African people are not living in the most dire conditions, living in conditions of poverty, living in conditions of inhumane kind of environments. And you see that here in the United States. You see that on the continent of Africa itself. You see that in Latin America. You see that everywhere African people are located, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Islands, even in China. for that matter, everywhere Africans are located, we suffer from the same conditions. And the relationship that we have with this system is the fact that, again, they were founded on our oppression. It is a relationship where they have been sucking our blood, taking our resources out of Africa for the longest. And I just want to say this because we have to understand where we've come from as to how we got to where we are to better understand what it takes to get out of this situation. And we have to understand that this social system was founded parasitic. There is nothing redeemable. There is nothing good about US-led imperialism. And we see this in this COVID-19 pandemic. We see that the ruling class is looking after its own class interests. You see that the trillions of dollars that they're printing up is the bailout. It goes to the banks. It goes to the large businesses. Even white workers who traditionally live at a standard of living so much higher than anybody else on the planet, just for benefit of supporting the system and living on the pedestal of all the oppression that everybody else suffers from around this planet. And you will hear from other people who are going to speak to that just through their introduction. I know they're going to address that. All of the resources benefits that. So when we look at what's happening with COVID-19, we see a naked reality, something that has been there all along. Some people just now coming to the conclusion of how corrupt this social system is. It's been this way for 600 years. It was born that way. It is that way now. And what it takes is for African people and other workers around the world to understand that we have an opportunity to organize to rid ourselves of this colonialist capitalist system. We have to organize, we have to build in our community. What we've been doing as the African People's Socialist Party since COVID-19, we have been building on the ground outreach in our communities. We've been postering in our communities all while we're doing the social distancing. We've been wearing masks, we've been wearing gloves, we've been going out in the community, putting posters up on the poles, informing the people how they can best take care of themselves, informing the people how they can make their own masks, how they can make their own hand sanitizer, how they can grow their own food, the best practices and how they can take care of themselves. And we've also tried to identify people who live in particular communities. We want to identify people who are Black captains, who can be Black captains, people who can organize on the block where they live. We can identify people right in the communities where they live who has access to water, who has access to masks, who has the things that we need in the community, who are the people in the community that need masks, that need water, that need food. And we want to create what we call community brigades, community satellites on the ground, community brigades, where we can create this thing and push our Black Ankh program that we have. And we call it Black Ankh because that is our response to the African community, similar to what we see in the capitalist world they call the Red Cross. And the Black Ankh is a way to, when African people deal with situations like what we saw with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and what we saw in Haiti with the earthquake a few years ago, and what we saw just recently in Sierra Leone, where thousands and thousands of Africans died in these mudslides. We want to have the ability to respond to these type of situations where a lot of our people are catching hell. And again, these type of situations are no different than the colonial virus that we've been dealing with for 600 years. We cannot separate this COVID-19 pandemic. It's just the latest attack on African people. It is not something that we look at as our problem, because if we really deepen and understand COVID-19, we understand that it is a crisis of imperialism. And it is a crisis that is being stripped out butt naked in terms of for the world to see the ineptitude of this government, of the peerless nation, to solve the problems of the people. The people must build the kind of organization on the ground to solve their own problems. And this is what we've done with the African People's Socialist Party. Just to say, we've got 50 institutions on the ground that we've been building over the last 50 years. We have, and I'm gonna name a few, the Burning Spear newspaper and Black Power Radio that we have in our headquarters in Florida. We have the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, a mass organization that wins the African workers to become part of a fighting organization on the ground in the communities where we live. We have Uhuru Foods and Pies, which is one of our dual and contending power institutions to build our own independent African economy. We see the African National Women's Organization as an extension of that, and one of the organizations. We have the African People's Solidarity Committee, where we have a strategy of building behind enemy lines, where we have organized white people under the leadership of the African Revolution to extend the African Revolution into the white community, where we see most of the stolen resources concentrated not only in the US, but around this world. We have other campaigns. I just want to leave it at that because I know I have a certain amount of time, but I want to really appreciate having this platform to just say a few things.
Uhuru, comrade, thank you very much. Yeah, and I apologize. You know, if people can just keep an eye on the chat, because I will be sending information there as we proceed. Thank you very much, comrade. Excellent. It's important to recognize that imperialism is alive and well, even within its colonial political borders. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and pass it on to the Palestinian Youth Movement. Comrade, if you can provide a presentation on these crimes of sanctions and blockades.
Definitely. So a lot of what I have to say actually is in conversation with my brother from the African People's Socialist Party, specifically on the question of the continuing legacy of colonization. Something that we say a lot in the Palestinian Youth Movement is that Nakba is not one moment. The moment of colonization is not an event, it's an ongoing situation, right? So how can we understand the ways in which those have experienced colonization, imperialism, displacement, are the ones who also experience the brunt of poverty and the brunt of continuing state violence? And something in particular that I wanted to think about for today, 2 different points actually, are really continuing the conversation that we just started on rhetoric and what the United States is saying that they're doing, and how they're framing the conversations around COVID. So if we look in the news, a lot of the language around COVID-19 is really militarized. So if we think about how COVID-19 is being referred to as the 9/11 moment, the Pearl Harbor, right? Or there are even estimations that the number of people that will die are the same number as the people who died in the Vietnam War. So something that in relation to imperialism that we in the Palestinian Youth Movement take contention with in those statements is 2 different points. One is the ways in which the US uses militarized language to galvanize people. So instead of trying to create conditions of empathy and acknowledge very really where materially the United States is with the pandemic, the tactic is to fearmonger, and is specifically to increase tensions around racism, around state violence. And thinking about how when they reference a Pearl Harbor moment or a 9/11 moment or the Vietnam War, or when this is called the China virus, how this rhetoric is supposed to reify a lot of the anti-communist sentiments, right? Or how it's also supposed to reinvigorate Islamophobia and Zionist attitudes in the United States and fortify them. So thinking about when they're talking about Pearl Harbor, what was actually happening in Pearl Harbor at the time is that the United States military was stationed in what was then native Hawaii on the verge of being finalized as conquest for the United States, right? We talk about the 2,000 plus United States soldiers that were killed, but we don't reference Nagasaki or Hiroshima. We don't talk about the internment camps that the United States created. So thinking about this selective invocation of imperialist narratives that the United States uses, a 9/11 moment, even the United States tries to sort of galvanize people around this idea that COVID-19 is a threat and it's a racialized threat. It's either a racialized threat that represents terrorism or it's a racialized threat that represents communism. and how it's a really, really subtle tactic that's not super subtle, but working to, at the same time, really validate United States norms. But something that I think is more important around that is it's distracting from also what my brother was talking about with the ineptitude of the United States, right? The United States has one of the worst responses materially and structurally. It has nothing to provide. So this sort of language around American exceptionalism is really sort of gaslighting people. And the same people that are feeling validated in their racist vigilante attitudes towards the East Asian community or towards Muslims or towards blank, right? Especially when we're looking at the communist and anti-communist rhetoric, those are the same people who are actually also experiencing a lot of structural violence because they are also working class people. So they are the white racist working class poor. But thinking about how these are not necessarily the people who benefit from the wealth or the enterprise that is the United States. And so really calling into question how this rhetoric works to sort of create support for a project that actually still doesn't benefit a lot of people. But on the flip side, another point that I wanted to highlight is also thinking about beyond the threat of militarized language and conservative language and what that's trying to erase is thinking about the humanitarian language that's going around with COVID-19 and thinking about how that's just as dangerous. So thinking about, for example, news articles or depictions that talk about the number of Palestinian refugees or Palestinians within colonized Palestine who are experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, or thinking about Kashmir, or thinking about Somali refugees in Kenya, right? Like these very glimpse narratives of where the pandemic is hitting, and thinking about how this humanitarian logic is also working to erase the ways in which imperialism causes the contexts of the people, right? So COVID-19 is not the reason that people are dying en masse. COVID-19 is not the reason that people now are struggling to decide whether they're gonna put food on their table or risk not having anything, right? It's colonialism, it's imperialism, it's occupation, it's all of the structural violences that are being augmented by the expansion of this pandemic. So thinking about how these languages, when they sound alluring, when we see all of these campaigns saying relief, relief, relief from popular NGOs or even from different governments, what it's doing is also validating this idea that the pandemic is a standalone problem, and that all of these people who live in poverty, who live experiencing state violence, are doing that in isolation from all of these other state violences that work to create their contexts. So just wanting to also invite folks to reconsider all of the different rhetorics that are being blown around for COVID, and how both of them are working to validate logics around imperialism, around Zionism as well. Specifically thinking of the ways in which colonialism and labor work together to really, really exacerbate COVID-19 and create these desperate contexts that we're thinking of. And the last point that I just want to uplift real quick is thinking about how popular struggle is so severely impacted by this pandemic. So if you look at protests and uprising in Lebanon that were taking place before this pandemic, if you look at different protests and uprising that were taking place in Palestine, thinking about how this pandemic, a lot of the radical organizations and radical organizers who service communities are the first people to do first responder work for the communities that are otherwise left to die. And how that's a tactic by the United States, right? To promote certain political legislation, to pass certain actions. The Zionist entity is still continuing home raids in occupied Palestine, right? We have ICE here, where we have more and more raids increasing, right? Thinking about how all of these different news coverings are actually gaslighting people into missing out on the ways in which state violence is exponentially increasing and taking advantage of and capitalizing this pandemic. That's all I have for now. Thank you again.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Conrad. Next, we'll go with Victoria Aragon, Anakbayan, San Diego.
Thank you. Thank you both for everything that you've said. I was trying to jot down notes. I appreciate the breakdown that both of you provided. But yeah, so just kind of going off of COVID-19 and how it's really highlighting the gaps that imperialism and capitalism has caused in our society, and even just like more specifically, I guess, with military spending. In particular, in 2019 alone, nearly 200 million US tax dollars directly went to the Philippine Army and police. And if folks aren't familiar with what's been going on there, Duterte has been waging what we call the three wars against the people: war against the poor, war on terror, and an all-out war against activists. So a lot of this funding that was received from the U.S. Has gone to approximately over 30,000 civilians have died in extrajudicial killings by Duterte since he has taken up administration. But in particular, since COVID-19, about 72.3 million US taxpayer dollars went to aid the Philippines via Operation Pacific Eagle. But in this time from approximately March 17th to March 29th, 17,309 Filipinos were arrested during this time, while only 3,303 Filipinos have been tested as of March 30th. So we can see here that the specific funding that was going to try to help the people has gone to just further oppress our people. So we can, I mean, I know these are kind of obvious things to say, but Duterte does not care about the people. Since then, he has deployed 40,000 Philippine military and police personnel with orders to kill, quarantine violators, enforce checkpoints, and restrict access to workplaces and food, while continuing to harm peasants, farmers, human rights defenders, and the countryside. So we can see that there is also a very specific attack on activists that are standing out against Duterte, and also more specifically this idea of anti-communism in the Philippines as well. There's a very specific attack on that in particular. There is this Operation Plan Stability, also known as Oplan Kapanatagan, which is a whole of nation approach that Duterte has taken on. It does not distinguish between armed combatants and unarmed civilians. There's an increased filing of trumped up charges against activists, labor leaders, and human rights defenders. And in Duterte's cabinet, there's more than 80 former military and police members. So we can see that the whole country as of right now is under de facto martial law, in addition to the still standing martial law in Mindanao, the southernmost region of the Philippines, which also houses a large amount of indigenous communities, in particular Muslim indigenous communities. And we can see particular attacks on those communities as well, and this utilization of Islamophobia and again, anti-communism to fight this terror threat. When in reality, it has caused, again, over 30,000 deaths, more than 450,000 displaced individuals. And let me see. Yeah, like it's forced a lot of people out of their communities. So we can see that COVID-19, this crisis is highlighting things that have already been present. It's highlighting things that, you know, it is the crisis of imperialism. We can see that, and we can even see that with this aid that is going to the Philippines right now for specifically COVID-19, it isn't going to the benefit of the people. It's still to create, for Duterte to rise his fascism, to have this, you know, iron hand fist on the Philippines. And we're here to say that we, you know, we demand for a cut to US aid in the Philippines, and instead to go to the services needed here, especially amidst a pandemic, instead of going to you know, countries abroad to kill people directly. And we can see that happening in the Philippines.
Thank you very much, comrade sister. We'll go ahead and recognize the Party for Socialism and Liberation. You go ahead and present.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you again to the panelists who spoke before me. You know, everything you said just kind of really ties together why it's so important that we're here and that we're coming together. We're standing up not only for the rights of workers here in the United States, but around the world. In just in the face of global capitalist imperialism. Today, I wanted to talk briefly about one specific part of this demand that we're here talking about tonight, which is no more sanctions, no more blockades, hands off Cuba. I want to talk briefly about the past and present of Cuba, and why it's such an important example for all of the issues we're talking about tonight and for how we can go forward. So just some brief background, Cuba, after hundreds of years of Spanish rule, became essentially became a US neo-colony. And I think, if I'm remembering right, it's something like 80 or 90% of the land in Cuba was owned by American corporations or other forms of American business, including almost all agriculture. It was actually one of the top sources of sugar for the US market. All of that changed in 1959 when a revolutionary movement of workers and peasants who were working the farmlands came to power, led by Fidel Castro, and implemented, massive changes in every aspect of society. One of which was nationalizing all of the farmlands and other industries that had been owned by American interests. And the response of the United States was to essentially fund essentially terrorism, to paying people to intimidate their neighbors through violence, up to and including murder. The United States also invaded and tried to overthrow the government in 1961 in what came to be known as the Bay of Pigs incident. But kind of most crucially to what we're talking about here today is they implemented sanctions in 1960, which have only gotten worse and which have been in place for the past 60 years. The sanctions essentially prevent, not only do they prevent any business from doing any kind of, any US business from doing business with Cuba or with agencies within Cuba, but they also seek to prevent other countries from also doing business in Cuba through just a huge series of extremely of laws that basically violate international law. And when the USSR dissolved between 1989 and 1991, Cuba lost their single biggest trading partner almost overnight, and was plunged into economic crisis because they had been importing a lot of food, they had been importing medications, trains and cars and kind of equipment's needed to run their country, and they lost the bulk of that, of those imports. And the United States response was not a humanitarian response, was not, oh, okay, we'll help you out, we'll give you a loan, or we'll start selling you food. The response of the United States was to tighten the screws and make the blockade even worse and even harsher, and make it even harder for Cuba to get any kind of international aid. That was through what was called the Helms-Burton Act, which was passed in 1996. And this led to just a massive crisis in Cuba. The average caloric intake dropped, I want to say 1,200 calories a day per person. And it wasn't until the end of the 20th century that that Cuba was able to get out of it. The idea behind the blockade of Cuba is the same as the idea behind any sanctions, which is to make the economic situation in the target country worse, and make the working people of that country and the oppressed people and the people basically at the bottom of whatever the social food chain are, make them suffer in the hopes that will pressure the government to change their policies or step down. And we can see from history that it doesn't work. All it does is increase suffering with no effect. And so through ingenuity and through being able to find new partners, both with thawing of relations with Russia and with the election of the revolutionary government of Venezuela, Cuba was able to come out of that and has been able to improve their economy, and people are eating again, and they're able to to go about their lives, where they weren't, 20, 25 years ago. as I wrap up, I do want to say I, along with a couple of other members of the PSL and supporters and people of the Inter-Coalition, traveled to Cuba last year, not as a vacation, but as part of a delegation to talk to people there, to talk to people who worked in the private sector and the public sector on cooperative farms. We spoke to doctors, union leaders, even small business owners, politicians, community organizers, and every single person that we talked to, without exception, talked about the blockade. And they all, when we would ask them, like, what do you want us to take back to the United States? What do you want us to tell people there? A, they would say, our problem is not with the people of the United States, it's with the government of the United States. And they would say, B, do whatever you can to end the blockade. Just because we are in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, I do want to bring up that Cuba's medical system, despite this massive blockade, despite the very real hardships of their economic situation in the face of this blockade, they've been able to develop one of the best medical systems in the Western Hemisphere, and they're actually sending crews of doctors around to countries all around the world. And the United States is trying to convince countries that Cuba is sending doctors to pick those doctors out with no regard for the health of their people. So that's time. So I want to leave it at that, but definitely something we should all look into, and we need to end the blockade on Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. If we can now have United Auto Workers, Karen Plasencia.
Thank you, Benjamin, and thanks to all the other panelists for your interventions. I learned some new things as well. So I think it's always good to have these exchanges, especially to talk to the people that are watching us today. And I'm with United Auto Workers, and I have also had the incredible opportunity of visiting Cuba. I have visited several times, but the first time I went to the island, I visited with a union delegation. So we got to travel from Havana to Santiago and back to Havana and visit union workers, whether it be hospital union workers in maternity centers, union workers in restaurants, any agency or workplace that you can think of. We visited and we spoke to the workers and got to have an incredible experience, which I think it's important to highlight our right to travel as well as US citizens, and be aware of the restrictions that we have on our travel to Cuba and the reasoning for those restrictions. And I truly do believe that it is an example of workers in power, an example of workers having their needs met to the best of everybody's ability, that the US oligarchy does not want workers here to see that incredible example. And one thing that I do also want to add is it's been the determination of Cuban people that has carried them through the harsh US sanctions that, like Eric was mentioning. And I think it's always important to be conscious of it's all caused by US sanctions. They do have one of the best medical systems in the world, even with the sometimes limited technology that they have due to the fact that they can't get, even certain pieces for the MRI machines to function because those certain little pieces are made in the United States and cannot be brought to Cuba. I did want to share some images that I have. I don't know if I can share my screen.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, let's see if I know how to do this. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight for us is defense, quote unquote, defense spending in the United States, right? How much money we spend on destruction, on war. This is taxpayer money because, again, US corporations don't pay their fair share of taxes. They don't sometimes pay any. So we as working people generate taxpayer money that is then used to attack other nations, to kill other people. The United States spends more money on quote unquote defense spending than the next 7 countries combined. And then I do have some images here from when we visited Cuba with our union, United Auto Workers, and other unions as well. And I think, it's really important to put into into context that the United States is ruled by an authoritarian government in which the president did not even win the popular vote. So the United States likes to speak of human rights and that being the reason for their interventions in other countries, but we don't have human rights here in the United States. As you all know, one of the main central our demands for this year's May 1st is healthcare for all, because as you know, our PSL, the Palestinian Youth Movement, the Palestinian Youth Movement mentioned, the reality is it's true. It's not necessarily just COVID-19 that is the enemy. Why is it that we are the country in the world that has the largest number of confirmed cases and the largest number of confirmed of COVID-19 deaths, even when we are the country that spends the most money on healthcare, right? Even when we don't even have testing. So the number of people with COVID-19 is actually a lot higher. And Cuba, a country, even with the limited resources that we have mentioned that they have, has been able to send medical brigades to over 22 countries. The United States cannot even support, even with all the wealth that they have looted and stolen throughout the world, cannot and will not, because it is not their priority to meet the needs of the people. So one thing that I wanted to highlight is at last year's May 1st in Cuba, the workers that led the march in Havana were the health workers, recognizing that health is one of the main priorities for the Cuban people. Of course, education and other things as well, but I thought that was really important to share with you all. And then we just have some images. This is from when we visited one of the hospitals and we got to speak to them about, the shortcomings that they do have with certain medications, and also got to learn about the incredible medical work that they do, how they have been able to find cures for lung cancer, how they have been able to find a cure for ulcers, right, for diabetic people, and to cure their legs and prevent them from being amputated, which has been amazing. They actually were collaborating with US doctors during the Obama administration when a lot of the sanctions were, relaxed a bit. And then when the current administration took office, they sent the Cuban doctors back and no longer have that program where US doctors and people here were going to be able to benefit from this amazing work that Cuba has to share with us. And that's also important to highlight, that we have a right, that we as human beings have a right to benefit from the incredible work that Cuba has done, and how much more they could do if we as a people were able to invest in our self-interest, in what benefits us, and to change the priorities of this imperialist nation. They also talked about their maternity clinics. They have maternity clinics all throughout the island where women that live in rural areas or have limited access to be able to visit a hospital during their last weeks of pregnancy are brought in to be able to have a comfortable place to be able to deliver their children. They have some of the lowest infant mortality rates in the world. We also visited schools, right? Spoke to teachers. Every single Cuban child is educated. Every child in Cuba knows how to read. Every child in Cuba goes to school, which is not something that we can say even for the United States. So I think it's just really important to put into context that the beautiful example that Cuba has to provide for us, that Cuba is health, and that we as people in the United States also have to advocate for our own rights as people, again, to have access to the incredible work that is happening, and to learn from the example of these workers being empowered. I want to stop sharing my screen now, but I'm not sure how to do that.
On top, you should see stop share.
Okay. So that's pretty much what I wanted to share. I think a lot of things have already been covered, but I think, it's really important that we as people in the United States not only have these conversations in context of Cuba is suffering, because Cuba is suffering, and so are many other nations, but they also have an incredible ability to get through the hard times because they are based on conviction. And Cuban people know that what they have on the line is their self-determination versus US empire. One of the things that the last time I visited Cuba, they were struggling with was access to gasoline. And one of the ways that they mentioned that they were carrying through that time is everybody that has a vehicle was ordered to stop and pick up people at bus stops. So it doesn't matter if you are, you know, a government person, if you are the president, whoever you are, if you were in your car and you had room for people, you were mandated to stop. And that is the biggest example of solidarity that I was able to learn and I saw. And I think it is an example that anybody who can should visit for themselves. We should demand a right to travel freely as people, because that is a violation of our human rights. And we have to call into question, again, US oligarchy and the rich US ruling class from their attacks on working people. When we see them tell us that our lives don't matter, that they have quote unquote literally said there are more important things than living, right? Us getting comfortable to our cozy lives and our millionaire, billionaire, trillionaire lives is more important than you and your lives. And we know that already, that is how they feel. So now is a time to take action. Now is a time to learn from example of people like Cuba, of learn from the people in Venezuela who majority voted to elect their president, Nicolás Maduro, who is their legitimate president, right? And the US has even recently attacked Maduro even more by putting a bounty on, literally a bounty on his head, which is, we must say absolutely not. We stand against that as US citizens, that our taxpayer money will not be used to overthrow democratic nations abroad. And we have to organize to make sure that we can have democracy here, because what we have in the United States is absolutely not a democracy. So we say end to blockades and sanctions. It's not gonna come from the rich oligarchy. So we as people have to organize to make that happen. And healthcare for all. And the biggest example of healthcare for all and an amazing healthcare that works for the people is Cuba. So we stand in solidarity with the Cuban people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, this conversation is, very rich in its content with all the panelists. I did forget to mention that I am representing the organization Unión del Barrio on this panel as well. So I did want to just give a brief summation. I'm not going to extend myself too much, because I do want to allow for time for some of the attendees that have already their hands up and some of the questions that came through. But I did want to, at least from the perspective of Unión del Barrio, first say that as an organization of Mexican and indigenous peoples on this hemisphere, we know what imperialism is, right? Because it invaded our lands, it stole our resources, it imposed a political border that today relegates our indigenous nation as foreigners on our own land. And so we reject the political borders that even exist. We have to say this in no uncertain terms, that imperialism, through its manifest destiny, through its American exceptionalism, has imposed a wretched, sick system that extracts not only natural resources, but also human labor with the objective of enriching a very tiny, small minority. And we have to say that we are the great majority of humanity that must overturn, that must destroy this wretched capitalist system once and for all. And today, if anything, this historical moment represents that possibility, right? And it will come into existence to the degree that we get organized. And this is fundamentally important for us as Unión del Barrio, because we recognize that a revolution has been happening throughout this hemisphere, throughout this continent, even throughout the world for many decades. Our political reference for a society of justice is revolutionary Cuba. And today we see, even today, this morning, the most reactionary, the most violent assault that can happen happened at the US Embassy in Washington, D.C. We have these maniacs, white nationalists that go up shooting up all kinds of the Cuban embassy that was established, yes, under Obama when the conditions, when the sanctions or the blockade was relaxed, but they still have their embassy, and it was shot up today. And so we know that the level of violence of this, there is no limits to what this country is capable of doing, because we've seen it historically from its wars, from its invasions, from its occupations. As the Palestinian Conrad said, they don't mention Nagasaki. They don't mention Hiroshima. It is the biggest crimes of humanity, and yet the United States has the audacity to talk about human rights. And when we look at just the situation, and I did want to reference the situation in Venezuela, because many people want to say that somehow in Venezuela there is no democracy. How dare the United States talk about authoritarianism when it is the worst authoritarianism that can exist is here within the belly of this imperialist beast. We have workers in power. The president, Nicolas Maduro, is a president that he himself is a worker, was a worker, comes from the ranks of the working class, who are building houses, who are building houses with the people themselves, right? More than 5 million houses have been built in Venezuela, but they don't want to show that. They don't want to promote that because it'll expose really what the United States is, right? These are housing the workers themselves, the people themselves in their own barrios, building homes for their own community. And it shows throughout the years how many have been built, more than 3 million so far, and they're going for 5 million. They have education as a fundamental human right, and they have a constitution that guarantees, in fact, there's language in their constitution that talks about human rights and the right to have healthcare, the right to have education, the right to have a roof over your head. And one of the things that because we are raza internationalists, right? We are internationalists in the sense that we recognize and know we have to go, we have to see for ourselves, because we cannot depend on what comes through the corporate media. Because if you base yourself on whatever comes through the corporate media, you're looking at the world through the lens of your oppressor. And it's really important for us to take off those lenses of oppression and go see for ourselves what's happening. We had the opportunity to visit La Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina, ELAM, an institution that was built by Fidel Castro, or a great Cuban revolutionary giant, who said, right, that we want doctors and not bombs. And they actually are in the process of preparing doctors throughout the world. And I want to show this image because, it was very striking, especially last year when the occupation forces of the Israeli Zionists went into Gaza and started killing. I mean, it's indiscriminate killing, all forms of genocide that is happening on our Palestinian brothers and sisters. And to know that the Cubans are providing preparation for doctors in the most oppressed and occupied places on this earth, it demonstrates the humanity, the concept of solidarity that we must point to as a political historical reference. And so we believe that it was very important to share that with this panel today, because this question of wars, the investment of this parasitic nation to go out and wage war and extract resources. And some people, say, well, why is it that we come? Well, number one, we didn't come, right? When they talk about immigration, we say, no, we've already been here as Mexicans and indigenous people on the one hand, right? But on the other hand, is because we're here because you're over there. You go and you bomb, you blockade, you overthrow democratically elected governments throughout this hemisphere, throughout this world, and then you wonder why we come here, because you're stealing all the natural resources of the world over in order to feed and maintain a fundamentally unsustainable capitalist consumer culture. And so what this pandemic is demonstrating, it is stripping naked the unsustainability of this system on the one hand because of the COVID-19 and lack of access to healthcare, but also on the other hand is that it depends of the world's resources in order to live this very affluent way of life that is fundamentally unsustainable for humanity. So I've come to time, and so I do want to, the poster or the image behind me, Sanctions Are a Crime, is one that was promoted by the Venezuelan comrades who are opposing these unilateral sanctions and the macro criminality of this sick imperialist policy of imposing sanctions on the world over. So I know that we're close to time, but we still have people here. So I want to ask the panelists if you're willing to stay a few more minutes, because I do not want to just simply end this because we're at time. So I want to see if we can extend if we're all good. And so this way we can engage some of the questions. So I see Mary Lou, she has her hand up. So let me recognize her. And I know that there was another question, I believe, in the Facebook, but I can't find it. So let me recognize Mary Lou. Mary Lou, are you there? If you can hear us, if you can ask your question. Mary Lou.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I just I want to thank everybody. It was a great presentation, but I have a slightly off-topic question. I had to miss last night's logistics meeting because of a friend's emergency.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there was any way to get the details of tomorrow's events or the
You know what, sister? Yeah, let's get that answer offline. So we will definitely get you that information. But,
okay, thank you.
But we'll go ahead and see if there's other questions, or if not, maybe we can engage in a dialogue here amongst the panelists. If anybody would like to take maybe a couple minutes to address what other panelists have asked or have presented, because I know that there was a lot of rich discussions.
On Facebook, it seems like it's going to be for Anak Bayan, and it says, I did not hear the military have been killing people in the Philippines. Has the military actually been killing people for breaking social distancing or for not wearing PPE?
So as of right now, I don't believe that there are any specific cases where somebody has been killed due to the quarantine violations, but Duterte himself has allowed for police and military personnel to take actions as needed. And even prior to COVID-19, he has been known to say that military personnel and police can do as they will, especially in particular, just a trigger warning, to use women however they please as well.
Thank you, sister. One thing that I did want to add, Benjamin, when we speak of war on people, is the wars that are happening within our boundaries as well, within these, not even ours, these colonial boundaries that this government has set up, is the people that are incarcerated, the people that are in migrant camps, right? That those are people that their human rights is being violated as well, and they're literally being sentenced to death during this pandemic. And we can see that the United States wants to speak about democracy in other nations and intervening in Venezuela and Cuba, but Cuba and Venezuela do not have children in cages. Cuba and Venezuela do not rip children from the arms of their mother and then say, oh, we don't know who the mother is. We lost track. We don't know which child belongs to which parent. We've actually already deported the parents, and the parents need to pay for DNA tests to figure out which child is theirs and if they can get him back. That the sick brutality of the savage oligarchy is what we have to fight against as working people.
Thank you, compañera. I fully agree. Any other comrade that wants to say a few words in response also to some of the other presentations?
I just want to really appreciate all of the other panelists here, and it has been so much that has been said, and I unite 100% in terms of the stance of the Cuban Medical Brigades and what they've been offering around the globe, not only just for this pandemic, but what they've always done. And again, we saw what was mentioned earlier by the PSL speaker, where he spoke of what Cuba was prior to 1959. And we saw that it was the rise of the people. It was what we saw socialists had the opportunity to seize power at that time, and that is what they've done. We've seen the capitalist response to that revolution that occurred just 90 miles off of the US coast. Well, we see since 1959, the US with the economic embargo of Cuba, where it is still a capitalist world. It is still a capitalist system. It is still an imperialism that is the dominant social system on the planet. And it is that way because it continues to steal the blood, the resources of peoples around the world. And that is why it is incumbent upon all people on this planet, whether you're in Palestine, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in the Americas, you must organize for power, to seize power, to hold power and to expand. The power that we have as workers, as people on this planet, negates the power of the imperialists to be able to colonize and exploit us. And the reality is that Cuba presents itself as a shining example of what we need to be doing. I was really applauding what I saw in Venezuela, where we saw under the Maduro regime, they said that people who are suffering from COVID, that there be no rent paid for 6 months. And you don't hear this in the US about no pay. You don't have to pay rent for 6 months. What we see is billions and trillions of dollars, like I said earlier, going to the ruling class. And people are still in the mail, watching their mailboxes, expecting this stimulus check, which is nothing. It doesn't even pay for a damn funeral. The reality is that we must begin to see that we have the opportunity to seize power, to organize the masses of people, particularly in the African community, in the indigenous community, in the Philippines. So I was in the US Navy at one point, and I was stationed in the Philippines, and I saw firsthand what this was under the Marcos regime in the early 70s, the brutality that happened to the Filipinos then. I've grown up as an African all my life here in the US, and I know what the brutality of this system, and we live in a dialectic where they have to live and we have to suffer because they suffer our blood. So we have to begin to negate the power of the imperialist bosses by, again, building power amongst the people, winning the ability for people to understand from a very philosophical perspective, because we must have science, we must have theory in order to guide our work practically. And I think it's important to understand the question of theory and have science. And that is something that the African People's Socialist Party believes in. And we have a philosophy that we call African internationalism that I'm not going to get into, but just to say that the question of philosophy is very important as we struggle to build the self-determination and the end to this colonial domination of African and other colonized peoples around the planet. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Comrade. I know there was a question that came in on Facebook directed to PYM. It does read, has PYM been able to maintain communication with Palestinians during COVID-19? How can we support?
Definitely. Before I answer that, if it's cool to just speak to some points that some of my comrades have brought up here,
Absolutely.
and I can answer that question. So I think some points that came up throughout folks' different panel presentations that are really important is, besides the fact that there is this enormous gap in wealth, I think a lot of the examples that people were highlighting also really demonstrate that money isn't necessarily what determines whether or not people will survive, in the sense that you have a lot of really effective responses to COVID in other countries, in countries that are considered poor by capitalist standards. So thinking about nations like Vietnam, thinking about the ways in which people power really also does drive how I guess people can overcome and resist certain things. And so I'm thinking of that to also, even though we have so much important analysis we need to do around the ways in which capitalism and imperialism and Zionism are working hand in hand during this pandemic, thinking about how the United States, besides the fact that it won't distribute the wealth, it's not necessarily the wealth that's going to determine whether or not the United States is able to survive this pandemic on an economic level, on a medical level, on all these different levels. And so I think the limitations of capitalism that everyone keeps referencing is really, really important to think about in terms of theory, like you were just referencing to my brother, and thinking about the practicality of a system like capitalism and what it's meant to do and how long it can sustain itself, and how it itself has its own ways that it'll dismantle, that it can't survive through. But also just wanting to touch on the points that were being raised around, I guess just thinking about, and it ties to this question of ways to support, but thinking about popular uprisings that have been taking place and thinking about how the increase in militarization and the increase in policing that takes place during this pandemic also reveals in which the ways the state knows that there is a really strong potential that people power maintains, right? And this is something that we've always known, that we know in every context of United States history. If you look at the rise of the prison industrial complex and how it relates to 1968, or even if you look at the humanitarian work that the United States has been participating in since the 1950s, that also stems in relation to anti-communist efforts, right? So thinking about how for the United States, there is an identified fear and anxiety and stress around the potentiality of people power and collectivity, and how this increased policing and this increase in repression demonstrates that even in this moment, in this pandemic, there is still this anxiety from this nation around what if people mobilize? What if people are successfully able to popularly organize, right? Whether we're talking about this country, or whether we're talking about the Zionist entity, whether we're talking about other places, there's this anxiety that I think is really reflected in the increase in all of these different repressive tactics that we always have to think about, to kind of be reminded about the power that we do hold, that can't be touched. But in relation to ongoing work right now, the Palestinian Youth Movement, our response on the national level, so thinking about within the United States, has been to engage in relief efforts for different community members. So thinking about Arab refugee communities, Muslim refugee communities, even in San Diego, a lot of our work has been this response work of translation, of trying to help folks figure out how to get access to resources in a way that's safe for them. And you see that taking place in other parts of the US through the PYM, like Texas, thinking about even outside the US, Toronto, and also wanting to uplift that in relation to our comrades in Palestine. We've definitely been keeping in touch through different organizing projects. So most recently, the Palestinian Youth Movement, PYM Women's Platform, has been connecting with different organizers from Palestine. But right now, what we do have that folks can support, and if they are able, is we have partnered with other folks and other organizations that we trust to raise funds for different refugee camps in Lebanon, for folks who are engaging in popular uprising. So for folks who don't know, Lebanon, there have been intensive popular uprisings for several months now. And this pandemic hit at a time when a lot of the oligarchy that exists in Lebanon has been taking place. And that actually, those uprisings started with Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And so thinking about how we want to support popular uprisings and support popular efforts to resist, and we want that to continue in the face of a pandemic, right? Especially because of a pandemic. So I can share a link for folks who are interested in learning more about that. And then I'm definitely happy to connect with anyone here or anyone who wants to have more conversations about ways to engage. There's a lot. Thank you very much again, folks. It's been an honor listening to everyone too.
Thank you for participating. I know that there is a couple questions. Well, number one, there was an acknowledgement here from Comrades Fernanda Colectivo Zapatista, just wanting to thank the panelists for the great presentation given. And you know, it's always good to have our comrades that we organize, you know, tune in and participate in these types of panel presentations. Also, there was a question just in terms of any resources that can speak to the how to support lifting the blockade from Cuba, and that was directed to either Eric or Karen.
I would say in terms of news sources, Telesur is a really good one, and they have a page in English and Spanish on Facebook. Also, Cuba Debate is a great source for news on Cuba. They also have a page, well, Telesur will cover not just Cuba, but Cuba Debate also has a page in English and Spanish. And I will honestly say, a lot of the information that I've gotten about Cuba and what really intrigued me to want to visit and learn, I actually learned from Unión del Barrio. So I also think their page is always a great source for sharing news on what's happening in Cuba. But if you're interested in following like other news pages or being, you know, knowing what's happening in the island, I would say Telesur and Cuba Debate, they're really good ones. And I don't know if folks have other ones to suggest.
Well, from the African People's Socialist Party, we have a response organization called APDEP, All African People's Development and Empowerment Project, and you can go to developmentforafrica.org, where we have information where we're trying to build community brigades, similar to what we see they've been doing in Cuba in terms of response to the Cuba thing, COVID thing. And I just think it's really important for us to link up and connect where we can. I think the biggest thing we can do is build in the areas where we are, build in the areas where we live. We must negate the power of the capitalist colonialist ruling class, which means sometimes we may not be able to get the resources necessary to Cuba that we should, but we can build where we are and build to take power. And I think that's fundamentally important. That is the kind of support that we know we can give, you know. So I just wanted to contribute that. Again, it's developmentforafrica.org.
Yeah, and I want to agree. All the I agree with the comrade from the African People's Socialist Party that building a movement, among us, among workers and oppressed peoples of the world is really important. And I want to agree with Karan about all those really important news outlets. I will say, as far as organizations that are doing a lot of this work, in addition to the ones mentioned, Answer Coalition does send delegations like the one I went on to Cuba every year or two. And there's also an organization called the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee, which was originally called the Committee to Free the Cuban Flag, which was formed to defend and fight for the release of 4 Cuban nationals who were arrested in Miami, excuse me, and charged and convicted on trumped-up charges of espionage, when in reality they were there researching U.S.-funded terrorists who had committed acts in at least one case bombings and killed Cuban civilians and were being harbored by the United States. So they came to the U.S. to find more information on that. Thank you, thank you, Karen. And they were finally released under the Obama administration. The last of them, 2 had originally been released, and then the last 3 were released. And then the Committee to Free the Cuban Flag became the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee, and they've been doing a lot of work trying to fight a lot of the issues we've been talking about tonight with U.S. imperialism against Cuba and against Venezuela. You can find them at cuba-venezuela.org, and they do a lot of really great work.
Thank you, comrades. Maybe as we start to wrap up this conversation, I did want to just acknowledge that this Saturday there will be a discussions precisely on lifting the blockade. I'll go ahead and share that on our Facebook Live, so this way people can get connected. We have, as Unilaterally, been very supportive of the Pastors for Peace, who have taken supplies down there, who have also networked and built and taken U.S. People from the United States, provided scholarships to participate in the Latin American School of Medicine, and some of those individuals have already come back to practice medicine here in the United States. So actually, there is that link, and we'll go ahead and share that information as well through the social media Facebook link as well. But any last words, so this way we can go ahead and start wrapping up the presentation. If anybody else would like to say anything before we close this panel.
I just wanted to say briefly again to thank the organizers for putting on this great webinar, and the presenters I think are fantastic. I just wanted to speak to just one thing that I know is not on the agenda we haven't spoke on, but someone spoke earlier about the uprisings that are occurring throughout the planet. And I just wanted to bring attention to the uprisings in the prisons inside of the US and outside of the US, but particularly these are 1 in 8 people in prison around the world is an African in prison in the United States. California has one of the largest prison systems on the planet right here. And the reality is that these are people who are locked up where social distancing is impossible, where they are given death sentences for being in prison. A lot of them for crimes of protecting and feeding and housing and clothing themselves. The crime is being committed against them, and that they are righteously rebelling inside of these prisons. You don't hear it in the news the way we need to hear it, but I just wanted to acknowledge that, and that we do need to reach out to the prison population and to let them know that we have great solidarity with these comrades who are locked up in these prison camps, and that we have to be able to free them and bring them into the revolutionary fray again to end this whole colonial contradiction that we see coming at the seams of this capitalist colonialist world.
Uhuru, comrade. Yes, and tomorrow is International Workers' Day, and we will start off by actually going to one of those concentration camps called prisons or detention centers, this for-profit run, grotesque institutions of oppression that are not only found here, but throughout the world by these private corporations. That is one place that we want to hit up and expose for the crimes against humanity that is taking place within the political borders of this imperialist beast. We will be beginning there at 10 a.m. So that will be informed to all of our friends and comrades, and there are already teams that we will be having actions throughout the county of San Diego, recognizing that we do have to take the appropriate measures to make sure that we fight the colonial virus and not get contaminated or contained or infected with this colonial virus, right, of COVID-19. So we did want to mention that. With that, any last words? If not, we'll go ahead and close this discussion. Again, appreciate all the panelists. Any last word?
I just wanted to say thank you as well too. Oh, sorry, did I cut somebody off?
No, please.
Okay.
Victoria.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all. This is my first time meeting some of you, so I'm looking forward to, continuing to organize virtually as long as we have to. And thank you for everyone who joined. Thank you, Unión del Barrio, for organizing and everything. And I'm looking forward to tomorrow, looking forward to moving our movement forward, and looking forward to finally smashing US imperialism.
Excellent. Well, with that, thank you very much to all the panelists again, and we will maintain contact now more than ever in this critical time. 1,000 blows to imperialism. Long live the people's workers' struggle throughout the world. Long live international solidarity. Gracias. Buenas noches a todos.